So today's daf is Pei Gimel, which is 83 in Eruvin, and we are on the bottom of Pei Bet Amud Bet. We are from the wide lines 4 lines down. And we talked about in the Mishnah the machloket about what is considered the quantity of seudah. What is the amount that's considered a meal? Because we want to determine how much needs to be. We know that you need to have shtei seudot. You need to have 2 meals worth of food in an eruv. Right. That was another argument. How we measure it, whichever the smaller of the 2 kinds of meals is. And then Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka said that mikikar bepundion midalit in basela, that the amount is a loaf that you buy with a pundion, which is a certain type of coin, when you can get 4 sa'in with a sela. So a pundion is 1/48 of a sela. So that's what it works out is he's giving you in terms of the price, how much you would pay for this loaf. Rabbi Shimon said, "Shetei yadot lekikar mishalosh lakav," that if you have loaves of bread that are 1/3 of a kav each, then you need shetei yadot. You need 2 of those. So what you end up having is 2/9 of a kav is the amount. Okay, because 1/3 of a kav is one loaf, where you would have 3 loaves equaling 1 kav, and you need 2/3 of one of them. Okay, so what it ends up being is, if you do the math, it should be a ninth, 2/9 of the loaf. So that was the argument that we had. So now we get to the Gemara. The Gemara says, Tana, the Tosefta says, "Ukrovim divrehim liyot shavin," that actually Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka and Rabbi Shimon are saying something that's very close. Is that really true? Midame, is that really true? That's not really true, because the Rabbi Yochanan arba seudat al-kaba, the Rabbi Shimon teisha seudat al-kaba. It's not true, because according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, you can get 4 meals out of 1 kav. Because according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, 2 meals is just a half of a kav. And according to Rabbi Shimon, 9 meals will be out of 1 kav. So how can you tell me that they're close to each other? They're not close to each other at all. One is telling you that that out of a kav you get 4 meals, meaning to say that a quarter of a kav is a meal. Okay, the other one is saying that 1/9 of a kav is a meal. So how can you say that they're close to each other? That's not close at all. Don't forget, you need to subtract 1/3 for the chenvani. In other words, when you purchase this, he told you a purchase price. The purchase price doesn't really represent what you get. So Rashi explains, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka lo izkir chatzi kav, that Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka doesn't say that you need that chatzi kav is the amount of flour involved. He doesn't tell you the half a kav of the amount of flour. He's telling you that we're measuring it by the loaf that you buy by a certain price. Okay, so what ends up happening is you only get 2/3 of what you pay for. You don't get a full third. In other words, you're not getting the full half of a kav, let's say, or the full quarter of a kav, but actually you're getting less than that. So if you were getting before, let's say, so Rashi says, that in this 2/3 of what you get, you're getting 2 seudot, which means to say, b'chatzi kav, 3 seudot. Really, in half of a kav, you would have 3 meals. If you actually had the half of a kav of flour and you were paying wholesale prices, okay? In other words, if you were buying if you actually had the flour of a half a kav, then you would have 3 seudot. But this person, because he's paying a retailer, he only ends up getting 2 seudot for his money. Okay, so in other words, from the chenvani, the guy who makes the loaves, he paid for the amount of money that you would pay him. He could buy 3 meals worth of flour, but you're only getting two.
So it's his profit margin?
It's his profit margin, because he tells you how much you have to pay. So in other words, so what does it end up being? So instead of having 3 seudot from half a kav, which is really what you would get normally, since you're paying retail, you're only going to get 2 seudot from the half of a kav instead of the 3. I'm sorry, no, it's the other way around. That really, really how it should work, really before he was saying that you got 4 seudot from a kav, right? So out of a half a kav you would get 2 seudot. That's what Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka is really saying. Now he's saying actually you would get 3 seudot out of that if you were paying wholesale. You would have gotten 3 seudot out of the money that you paid, and you would have ended up getting, therefore, out of an entire kav, 6 seudot, whereas Rabbi Shimon is saying 9. But still it's a problem because it's not that close. So, but still you have still it's 6 versus 9. That's not so close. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka is saying out of a kav you would get 6 meals. Rabbi Shimon is saying you would get 9 meals if you're, and we're talking about, he doesn't give a price. He doesn't give a purchase price.
It's not a big difference between
6 versus 9 meals? That's a lot. That's not close. That's not that close.
there are only 8 meals.
No, that's the next answer. You're jumping ahead. Ela ki idach de Rav Chisda. This is the 8. Now they're with 6. Ela ki idach de Rav Chisda. Now with Rav Chisda, we go like a different version of Rav Chisda. The Amar Yatzamein Mechetzalach Henvani. According to the second statement of Rav Chisda, you don't pay a 1/3 markup, you pay a 50% markup to the baker. And if you're paying a 50% markup to the baker, what do you end up having? That means that instead of out of a kav having 4 meals, actually you could have gotten 8 meals out of a kav. Not 4. It's just that you're paying retail, so you end up paying a 50% markup. So that's the reason. But really, out of a kav, you should have really 8 meals. And then you have Va'akati lemar tesho lemar timane. So now you have 9. Rabbi Shimon says 9, and Rabbi Yochanan is saying 8. So hainu tekamaru krovim devreim liot shavin. That's why it says they're close to each other. They're not exactly the same. But really, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka is saying that if you look at it from not the buyer's perspective, but you look at it from the baker's perspective, then what he can do with that amount of flour, with the kav of flour is produced. In other words, with the pundion, he could produce two seudot because he produces out of a kav 8 seudot. Okay, and according to Rabbi Shimon, 9 seudot would come out of a kav. So you have it's very close. They're very close in their analysis. It's not that far.
And the purpose of all of this
is to determine what the measurement of 2 meals is.
But it also is to wipe out the difference, to resolve the difference between them.
Because the Tosefta said they were really close to each other. So how is that really close? If one says 6 and one says 9, that's not close. If one says 4 and one says 9, definitely not close.
So it was to explain the Tosefta.
Right.
Tosefta's, I guess, reason was to get rid of the difference. So it wouldn't be
right. Well, they must have had an understanding of them that was different than what we had. In other words, we thought that the person is buying, that when he describes buying these 4 kav, that he's talking about from a retail perspective. So that in which case you wouldn't get as much out of it. He's saying no. I mean from the wholesale. Oh well, now you're talking about 8 meals out of the 1 kav. For a pundion, you could get 8 meals if you're paying wholesale. Now, Kasha de Rav Chisda, but we still have a problem, because in one case Rav Chisda said that the baker's markup is 1/3, and then he said a half. So which is correct? So, la kasha hadika yehiv balabait tzivei had la yehiv balabait tzivei. It depends on the markup. Depends. If you supply the wood to the baker for baking your bread, then you get a cheaper price. You only have a 1/3 markup. If you don't provide it, then you have to give a 50% markup. And in this case, the measurements that the Mishnah was working with was where you don't give it, so you end up paying a 50% markup, and that's why the pundion could buy you, in theory, 8 meals. Because the wholesaler is actually buying 8 meals with the pundion. You could get from the wholesaler, either you're going to end up getting a 1/3 markup, or you're going to end up getting a 50% markup, depending on how much you contribute as the buyer. When you come to the store, when you come to the bakery. So we also said 2 other measurements. Half of this measurement that we mentioned. In other words, we first mentioned what's considered a meal. Okay, what's considered to be a seudah, and then we said half of this is what's considered to be for a bait minuga. which is if a person walks into a house that has tzara'at, he immediately becomes tameh. But his clothes don't become tameh unless he spends enough time in the house that he could eat a certain amount of food. And it's half of this measurement that we talked about in the Mishnah as a meal. Okay? And half of that, in other words, a quarter, is going to be the amount that you have to eat to become tameh, because the rabbis made a gzerah. Normally, food cannot make a person tameh, but if you eat tameh food, the rabbis made a decree that you would become tameh, and you have to eat a certain amount, which is a quarter of what is defined as a meal. So half of what's defined as a meal is the amount that you would eat that would make your clothes become tameh in the house that has tzara'at, and half of that is what you would have to eat not in a house of tzara'at, just tameh food to make you tameh. And now the Tosefta says on Pei Gimel Amud Aleph, the Tana v'chatzi chetzia, a half of a half of a half, or an eighth of this measurement is litameh tumat ochalin, is what can convey tumat ochalin, what can convey impurity from one food to another. Now, if you look at the Rashi on the very top of the page, you will see that Rashi gives us the mathematical relationships that we need in order to understand the ensuing sugya. So, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, this measurement of tumat ochalin is going to be 3/4 of an egg. Kabetza chaser ravia. That's how they always say it, okay? So it's a kabetza minus a quarter. How so? Shareu shi'er bakikar shel rova kav keda'amar mechatza sachar lechenvani. I'm reading Rashi right now, because he measured that if you have a quarter of a kav, okay? So you have in one loaf a quarter of a kav. Okay, when you take into account all of the other calculations there, a quarter of a kav is what you're going to get when you pay the chenvani, when you pay the shopkeeper. Okay, nimtza kikar b'pundion rova kav. So really, when you pay your pundion, when you pay your coin, you get a quarter of a kav, because remember the retail value was a fourth of the kav is what you get for your pundion, and the wholesale value was you actually get an eighth. For this, in other words, you get 8. You're going to get twice as much out of it. He's charging you more. So anyway, so the kikar is rova kav vehen vav betzim, okay, which translates to 6 betzim, 6 eggs. Chetzia gimel betzim lebet hamenuga. So now we have to divide that up. So we have 6 eggs in this one loaf is 6 eggs. The one loaf. Now we divide that into half, which was the amount that you have to eat in the house that has tzara'at in order for your clothes to become tameh. You have to spend enough time in the house that you could eat half of the loaf, which is gimel betzim, 3 eggs. Now what's half of that? V'chatzi chetzia betza umechetza lefsol takviya. And therefore 1.5 eggs is how much you have to eat in order to make yourself tameh if you're eating impure food. That's the rule. Okay? And therefore, for a quarter of a quarter of a quarter, a half of a half of a half, which is 1/8, it's going to be 3/4 of an egg. So 3/4 of an egg is the end of is for one food to make another food tameh. So each time we're dividing it by a half. We're subdividing it further. And Rabbi Shimon, according to Rabbi Shimon, sheshi'er bakikar migimal akav kikar shelema chet betzim. According to Rabbi Shimon, that says no, the loaf that we're talking about when we talk about loaves is actually contains 8 eggs, because it contains 1/3 of a kav, not 1/4 of a kav. And therefore, since it contains 1/3 of a kav, it has 8 eggs. Half of that is 4 eggs, half of that is 2, and half of that is 1. So according to Rabbi Shimon, you have 8, 4, 2, 1. Okay? And according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, you have 6, 3, 1.5, and 3/4 as the subdivisions. Okay? Now we come to what the Gemara is going to do with all of this information. So, V'tana didan ma'itama lo tani tumat ochalin. Now, our Mishnah talks about the measurement of a loaf. And then it talks about the measurement of half a loaf for somebody who ends up being in a house that has tarat. And then it talks about half of that for someone who eats tameh food. Why doesn't it mention half of a half for one food making another food tameh? Why doesn't it mention that case, like it says in the Tosefta? So the answer is because because they're not exactly commensurate. The fractions are not precise. How so? Titania, as we learned in a Braita, kamashi or chatzi paras. When we talk about half of a paras, which again is the amount that if you eat it in the house that has tzara'at, you are going to be. If you eat it, if you eat this kind of a food, it's going to make you tameh because it's half of a pras. A pras is what you eat in the house that has tzara'at that will make you tameh. Half of a pras is 2 eggs, which means it's following Rabbi Shimon here. So we say it's going to be half. So chatzi pras is bet betim. Okay, shne betim. Chaser kim'ah, a little bit less. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. In other words, it's going to be a little bit less than 2 betim. Not exactly 2 eggs, but a little bit less. And Rabbi Yossi Omer, Rabbi Yossi says, Shne betim sochakot, 2 large eggs. In other words, you're going to measure these eggs more generously, more loosely. You're going to come up with a measurement a little bit bigger. Shi'er Rabbi shne betim ve'od. Kama ve'od echad me'esrim. Rabbi measured it, babetza, that each egg is an egg and 1/20th more. So he added on 1/20th to each egg. Or if you had 2 eggs, that would end up being 1/10. Okay? More. So these measurements are ve'ilu gabe tumat ochalim, but when we come to tumat ochalim, we come to the case of one food making another food tameh, rather than the food making you tameh. The one food making another tameh. Tanya Rabbi Natan v'Rabbi Dosa amru kabetza she'amru kamo klipata v'chachamim omrim kamo belo klipata. So there's a machloket. Rabbi Natan and Rabbi Dosa say that we measure an egg as the egg including the shell, and the chachamim say it's the egg without the shell, it's the peeled egg. But the point is that it's 1 egg even, whereas the measurements of 2 eggs were not even. It was either a wide measurement or a little bit less than 2 eggs, or maybe it was, rather than being a little bit less than 2 eggs, it was an egg plus 1/20th. So those measurements were not precise. In other words, the fraction now, when we talk about the amount that will make another food tameh, we know we're talking about a kabetza. So a kabetza is exactly a kabetza, either with the shell or without the shell, but not a little bit less and not a little bit more. Whereas the measurement for what you have to eat to make you tameh, since it's only a d'Rabbanan, it's not as precise, and some say a little bit less, some say a little bit more, some say a 20th more. So it's not an exact fraction, so therefore it wasn't included in our Mishnah. Amar Rav Chizda, I'm sorry, Amar Rav Papa, Amar Rav Chizda, Rav Ram Bar Papa said that Rav Chizda said, Zod divrei Rabbi Yehuda for Rabbi Yosei. These are Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosei's opinions. But the Chachamim say it has to be an egg and a half, not 1 egg. Uman Chachamim, Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka. That's Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, because this Braita that says that the amount of food that makes another food tameh is going to be 1 egg, right? Or it's going to be, because we've been doing these fractions, so it's going to be 2 eggs that are large, or slightly less than 2 eggs, or 2 eggs plus 1/10, right? Those measurements are only according to Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosei. But according to the Chachamim, 1.5 eggs is what you have to measure, not 2. Why? Because we're following Uman Chachamim, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, because we're following Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka said that you start not with 8, then going to 4, then going to 2, but you start with 6, going to 3, going to 1.5. So what you really need to determine how much is going to make you tameh is 1.5, not 2. Pshita, isn't that obvious? We already knew that Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka held that it was 1.5. But sochakot inan, it had to tell what Rav Chizda wanted to tell us, what Rav Ram Bar Papa wanted to tell us in the name of Rav Chizda was that it's not enough to have 1.5, but you have to have a generous 1.5. We do sochakot, which means a loose measurement of 1.5, not exactly down to the wire 1.5, but rounding, estimating in a generous way the 1.5 eggs. Kiata Rav Dimi Amar, when Rav Dimi came, he said, Shigir Bunyus leRabbi Modiyad de Kondes, that Bunyus sent to Rabbi a Modiyad de Kondes, which was some kind of a measurement of a se'ah of flour, okay, or a se'ah of something, whatever it was, let's assume flour. Okay, it's the volume measurement. And he sent it to him from this he sent it to him from Kunde, from Demin Neusa, from Neusa. Okay? So it was some kind of a special measurement, Modia Kundisa, from Neusa, from this place called Neusa. And what did he find? V'shi'er Rabbi Matan Ushva Esrei Be'in. And he found that it was 217 eggs. Okay? So now the Gemara is going to try to figure out the mathematics here. So the Gemara asks, Ha-se'ah what kind of se'ah are we dealing with here? If we're dealing with the se'ah of the midbar, the original measurements in the midbar were increased over time. There were 3 periods of increase. There's what's called the midbari, the Yerushalmi, and the tzipori. So each time they increased the measurement. So what was originally called the se'ah became less than a sa'ah. They increased the amount that would be a sa'ah. So we'll see how that works. So if you're going by the original measurement that they had in the midbar, 144 eggs was the measurement of a sa'ah before. And you can do the calculation by figuring out how many eggs goes into a kav, how many, and so on, and how many kabim go into a sa'ah. So it comes out to 144. Ve'id Yerushalmit kuf ayin gimel avya, and if you're telling me that he had a Jerusalem sa'ah, that's 173. Okay? Ve'id tziporit resh zayin. And the tzipori one is 207. In other words, each time that they increased the measurement, they increased it. They still called it a se'ah, but in the beginning it was 144 eggs, then it became 173 eggs, then it became 207 eggs. Each time they expanded the measurements. So the olam, the tziporit. So, but how did he get 217? 217 is too much. So what se'ah is he using? So really it was the tzipori. But however, aiti chalata shade alayu. So what he did was he included the chala. In other words, it was 217. The se'ah was 217 because you have to consider how much is included for chala, for taking chala. But so the Gemara asks, chalata kama havyan timane. Still, how much is in chala? If you had chala, so what are we talking about here? So we're talking really about the tzipori, which means it's 207 se'ah. But you're telling me that I need to add on the portion that would have been taken out as chala, because I'm left with 207. But I started out with more, so how much would I have started with? Well, if you do the calculation, it turns out you would have 217, because the amount that you take for chala should be 1/24th. 1/24th. So if you do the math, as Rashi does here, it's complicated math, but you can take my word for it and read the Rashi. Basically what ends up happening is, if you round it off, roughly, you have to round it off, it's a rounding process, but it comes to approximately 8. So if you add 8 to 207, what do you get? 215. That's still less than what Rabbi said he had. Rabbi said he had 217 and for the se'ah. And we're taking that to mean that he had 217 and he subtracted out what he needed to take for chala and he was left with a se'ah. But that's not true, because if he subtracted out 8 that he took for chala, then what will still end up happening is that he'll still have 209 instead of 200, right? Instead of 207, which is what he should have. So akati batzarle. So he's still not going to have enough. Ela aiti ve'odot Rabbi shadai alayhu. Rather, what you have to do is take the ve'odot of Rabbi. Remember, Rabbi, when he measures an egg, he says you add 1/20th onto each egg. Okay, so what you will end up having is, if you add 1/20th onto each egg as part of your measurement, you can do the math just roughly in your head, and you started out, let's say, with 207, right? So in 207, what are you going to end up adding from 207? If you have 1/20th added for every egg, you're going to end up adding onto that already 200 over 20. What are you going to end up with? If you have 200 and 1/20th for every egg, you're going to end up with 10, right? It should be, right.
So he's
right.
counting challah.
Right, they took that out. They rejected the challah thing. So now they're saying what you're going to end up having is 10 more eggs added to the bunch. That's just out of the 200 that he has. And then you'll have the additional 07. So for the 07, even if you had 1/20th, so you're not going to come out with a large number like 10, but you'll come out with also an additional fraction added to it. Okay? So then what will you end up having, though? You'll end up having 217 plus a fraction. right? Because since you started out with 207, and the first 200 you divide evenly, and you're able to add on 10 eggs, because you do the fractional numbers, you divide you put the 200 over the 20, and you end up with 10, right? So then you have the 217 plus whatever the 7 over 20 would be that's left, right? So now, but now you're going to have too much, because it's going to be 217 plus. So it should say that Rebbe measured 217 plus, but he didn't count it because he was only counting whole numbers. That's basically the answer. So therefore, according to Rebbe, he's going to measure 217 in a se'ah, because he's going to add always 1/20th for every egg. It says that we add a sixth. The Sa'ah Yerushalmit, the Jerusalem Sa'ah, was a sixth more than the Midbar one, the one that they had in the desert. And similarly, the Tzipori one was a sixth more than the Yerushalmi one. What turns out is that the one of Tzipori was a third more than the one of the Midbar. We're going to find out that doesn't make any sense, so just hold on for a second. But what I just want to clarify is that when the Gemara talks about, or the Mishnah talks about adding a sixth, it means what they call a shit milevar. Shit milevar means that now it's a sixth, but it wasn't before. In other words, let's say you have 100. Okay? In the Talmudic terminology, adding a sixth to 100 means taking 1/5 of 100 and adding it on. Okay? So 100, 1/5 of 100 is 20, and you add it on, you get 120. Now that 20 is 1/6 of the total. Correct? It's true, right? Am I right?
Yeah,
okay. So when they say adding a sixth, that's what they mean. They mean adding a fraction such that that fraction is a sixth. Now, in the final number. So they don't mean, let's say, starting with 100, taking a sixth of 100 and adding it on to the number. What they mean is taking a fifth of 100, taking 20, and adding it to 120. So now the 20 is a sixth of the total. Okay, so that's what they mean when they say adding a sixth. I just wanted to clarify that. So now we're going to see how these fractions work. So Shalish Diman, what do you mean that the Tzipori is a third more than the Midbari, than the desert measurements? If you're telling me that it means that it's actually a third of the Midbar, what would a third of the Midbar number really be? We said what the Midbar number of a Sa'ah was before, because we said that the Midbar number was 144. It would actually be Arba'inu Tmanya. It would be 48. If you were to take a third, it would turn out to be 48 would be the number. Now, ve'ilu odfa shitinu tlat, but actually the Tzipori number is not 48 more, it's 63 more than the Midbar number. That is not a third more, but that's actually that's more than a third more. So rather, ve'ela shlish de Yerushalmit, are you telling me that it means it's a third of the Yerushalmit more? In other words, that whatever a third of the Jerusalem measurement is, if you add that to the Midbar measurement, you'll end up with the Tzipori measurement? No, because Shlish Dida Kama Have, how much is the Jerusalem measurement when you split it in a third? Chamshinu Tmanyan. Nachi tilta. It actually comes out to be 58 minus a third, okay? Or 57 and 2/3. Is one, because we said that the Jerusalem measurement was 173. So if you divide it by a third, you're going to end up with 57 and 2/3 as a third. So ve'ilu odefa shitin utlat, and still the Tzipori measurement is 63 more, not 57 and 2/3 more than the Midbar one, than the one from the desert. Ve'ela de Tzipori shelish dida. Rather, the Tzipori, how much is a third of it? Shiv'in, 70, because so Shiv'in nachich hada, it's 70 minus 1. Okay, it's actually 69. Right, because really the measurement of the Tzipori Sa'ah is, we said before, 207. So if you divide that in thirds, you take a third of it, it's going to be 69. So v'ilu odfas samach gimel. So it can't mean that it is a third more of its own third. In other words, because its third is 69, and it's 63 more than the one from the Midbar, not 69 more. So rather, Ella Am Rabbi Yirmiyah Hachikamar, what we mean is Nimtzet Ashal Tzipori Yiter al Midbarit Karov L'Shlish Shala. V'shlish karov lemechetza demidbarit. That what it means to say is that the sa'ah of tzipori is an amount greater than the original desert measurement that they had in the times of Moshe Rabbeinu by its own third. In other words, almost its own third. It's close to it because its own third would be 69, and it's actually 63 more. Okay, which is close to half of the measurement of the midbar, because half of the measurement of the midbar measurement was originally 144. So it's close to half of 144, because half of 144 is 72, right? So it's pretty close. So then, Matkif la Ravina says, Midi karov katani. Does it say that it was close? It doesn't say it was close. It says it's a third more than the midbar. So what's it talking about? Ela amar Ravina says, Hachikamar nimtzet shlishot tzipori ve'odiot shel Rebi yetira mechetza shel midbarit shalish betza. He says, actually, what it meant was something very convoluted and complicated, which is, if you factor in the 1/20th of Rebi again, okay, so that brings us to what? What did we figure that brings us to? It brings us to 217 and change, right? Once you factor in, it brings you to 217 and change instead of 207, and you take a third of that. Okay, what it's going to come out to, as Rashi explains all the complicated mathematics, is that you're going to end up with. He says if you count it that way, that he has 217, so a third becomes ayin bet ushlish betza. It becomes 72 and a third. And what ends up happening then? And half of the original wilderness measurement was shlish betzah demechatzad midbarit ayin bet, because the original measurement of half of the original measurement was 72, right? Because the original measurement was 144. Half of it was 72. Now, a third of the current measurement, in other words, what he's trying to say is, he says it in a convoluted way, he's saying a third of the current measurement of tzipori is more than half, is a third more than half of the original measurement of the midbar. In other words, the original measurement of the midbar was 144, which means half of it was 72. And the current measurement, a third of the current measurement is 72 and a third. So that means that a third of the current measurement is slightly more than half of the original measurement, because the original measurement was 72 even. The current measurement, a third of the current measurement is 72 and a third. Okay, so it turns out that it's just trying to show you how much it's changed in relative distance. That what was originally half the measurement is now not even a third of the measurement. It's a fraction less than a third. Now, all this complicated mathematics is to make sure that you did well in high school and you can follow it. Okay, actually not even, I guess middle school. Okay, so Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught. Reshit arisotechem, it says you have to bring the beginning of your dough. Now we turn to Pei Gimel Amud Bet. Kedei isotechem. Arisotechem means, arisotechem literally means the kneading troughs. So isotechem means you have to bring the amount that is a dough. V'kama isotechem, how much is a dough? Kedei isat midbar, the amount that was kneaded kneaded with a K, in the wilderness. V'chama isat midbar dechtiv ve'omer asir taifau. That an omer was the amount, and an omer is a tenth of an ephah. And what the calculation of an ephah is like this, as Rashi explains. So Rashi says that basically an ephah works like this. That an ephah is 1 second. The omer is 1/10, right? So 3 se'in is an ephah. Okay, so that's the first step. So an ephah is made of 3 se'ah. 3 se'ah is actually made of 18 kabin, because you multiply it by 6. There's 6 kav in a se'ah, which comes out to be 72 lugin. Okay, and a tenth of the lugin comes out, and a tenth of the 7 lugin comes out to be 7 lugin, and a tenth of the 2 comes out to be 1 point. What is it here? A tenth of the 2 comes out to be what? I guess point two. Right, point two. Right, so it's a fifth. Okay, so that makes sense. It's chomesh aluk. So if you calculate it all the way down, what you end up having is you will end up with 7. So he says, "V'hainu dekamar zayin riva'im ve'od." You end up with 7 quarters. Okay, 7 quarters because you have 7 log plus the fifth of a log. Okay, so he says that it ends up being 7 quarters and more. So that's why it says zayin riva'im kemach. You need 7 quarters and a little bit more. Ve'od chayevet b'chala shehen vav shel Yerushalmit. That when it was translated into the Jerusalem measurements, which were a little bit larger, so then what ended up happening was that extra remainder of the fraction was subsumed and became just 6 even. Okay, and even 6 kav, and then what you end up having is shehen hey shel tzipori, that it ended up, when they changed the measurement, it ended up being 5 of the tzipori measurement. Mikan amru ochel kamida zo harei ze barei u'mivorach yeter al ken ra'avtan pachot mikan mekulkal b'me'av, that they said that this is the amount the person should eat in a day, that if they eat this amount they'll be healthy and blessed. If they eat more of it, then they're a glutton, and if they eat less, then they're going to get sick to their stomach. So the way that it works out is that you have the if you measure it in terms of if you chart the evolution of measurements over time, so it started out being 7 quarters plus, then it ended up being 6, and then it ended up being 5 in the end, 5 kav, according to the later kabim. But the point is that this affected how you would measure the amount of flour that needed to be in a dough to require challah to be taken from that dough. So now the new Mishnah gets us away from mathematics for a minute. We'll start it. Anshe chatzer v'anshe mirpeset sheshachacho v'lo ervu. So the members of a courtyard and the members of an upper area, like a balcony sort of area, second floor, sheshachacho v'lo ervu, they did not make an eruv with one another, but they made an eruv independently. So the upper floor, the gallery area, made an eruv for their shared area. Imagine a motel. It has the upstairs and has the downstairs, and the upstairs is outside and the downstairs. So the upstairs made their own eruv and the downstairs made their own, but they didn't make one together. And the upstairs walks into the same courtyard, but they come from, let's say, a staircase that lowers them into the courtyard. So what happens is that since they didn't make an eruv, they can't carry back and forth between their own space. But the people in the gallery, the upper area, are allowed to carry in their own, and the people in the lower area are allowed to carry in their own. So, kol shegavoa yud tfachim lamir peset pachot mikan lachatzer. Choliat avor v'asel gavoim 10 tfachim lamir peset pachot mikan lachatzer. So we have a general question, which is, how do we determine what things belong to the gallery, to the upper area, and what things belong to the lower area? So if you have something that's 10 tfachim in elevation, so it's over the airspace of the ground, so that means that it belongs to the people living on the second floor. Anything lower than that belongs to people living on the ground floor. Because they can't share anything, because they didn't make an eruv together. So things that are reserved for the use of the people on the ground floor can't be used by people on the top floor. And whatever's for the people on the upper floor can't be used by people on the lower floor. In other words, we're talking about carrying objects.
These are things in the courtyard.
Things in the courtyard, but let's say there's an elevation in the courtyard that actually I'm standing on the second floor, but it's right next to me. Right? Because it reaches up. So for the person in the courtyard to reach it, they would have to climb up. But for me, it's at my window, because I'm on the second floor. But that's only talking about if it's right next to the building. This makes perfect sense. Why? Because if I'm on the second floor of my building, there happens to be that there's an elevated area that's at window level with my building, my floor of the building. So a person in the chatzer below couldn't access it. But if that pillar or whatever is far away from the building, so it's not accessible from the second floor anyway. It's only accessible from the courtyard, and therefore it belongs to the people who have the rights to the courtyard, and not to me, because I live on the second floor and I only made an eruv with the people on my floor. Okay, and the definition of close is it has to be within 4 tefachim of my building. If it's more than 4 tefachim away, it's no longer within my grasp. The Gemara says pshita. This is obvious. That if you have It's obvious that if two people, in other words, you have a shared area between two buildings, or it doesn't necessarily have to be an upstairs and a downstairs, but any two shared two areas, two enclosures that didn't make an eruv with one another, but share something in the middle. They share some space in the middle. So it's pshita, it's obvious that if you have something that both sides enter by a door, in other words, they each have a way to get to it that's a direct access. They're equal in their access. So there we say, this is like a chalon sheben shte chatzerot, that it's like having a window between two chatzerot, meaning neither of them can use it. They prohibit each other because it's in between them and neither one owns it exclusively. So neither one can carry into that shared area because it's the other chatzer will prohibit them. Now, let's say lazeh bezrika ve'lazeh bezrika hainu kotel sheben shte chatzerot. If neither one can easily access it, they both have to throw something to reach it. So there's an elevated area between two enclosures. So it's like a wall in between two enclosures. And what do we say about the wall in between two enclosures? If it's a large area, then they share it, and it's a problem unless one gives up to the other one, or unless one has more direct access than the other one. But if they both have not good access, both of them have limited access, so then it's prohibited to both. Because they're sharing it, they equally can't get to it, basically. They equally would have trouble getting to it. Now, let's say you had that it was not an elevated area, but it was a below ground area. So that the only way that you could access it is by lowering, let's say, a bucket down there or going down a rope. So then, again, it's a ditch or something. So, hainu charitz sheben shte chatzerot. That's the same as the case of the charitz between two chatzerot, between two courtyards. The ditch between two courtyards. That it's equally inaccessible to both. Lazeh b'petach v'lazeh b'zrika. Let's say one has a direct opening and one has to throw something to get there. So in other words, one has ease of access and one does not. Hainu de Rabba bar Ravuna, Amar Rav Nachman. This is identical to what Rabba bar Ravuna said in the name of Rav Nachman, Lazeh b'petach v'lazeh b'shulshul. If one had a door and one had to lower it, Hainu de Rav Shizvi, Amar Rav Nachman. Okay, so there you have the case. In other words, in any case where one party has easier access to than the other one, so one has they can directly walk into the area. For the other one, it's elevated. Or one has direct access, and for the other one, it's below them, so they can only reach it by lowering something. So in both of these cases, what's the rule? In both of these cases, we grant use of that area, so the one that has the easiest access, we say that's the party that deserves it, and the one that has more difficult access doesn't deserve it. So if they're both if it's easily accessible to both, they're both prohibited unless they've joined together. If it's equally inaccessible to both, then they both can't use it because again they're equal. But if one has greater ease of access than the other, so then we say that one has exclusive right to use it on Shabbat, and the other one can't use it. So actually it's a better situation. And then it gets into the case of what happens when you have two complicated things, where both parties, neither party can easily access it, but one has to go up and one has to go down. And then it takes us into the next Amud, so we're going to continue there tomorrow.